everyone. I'm here to talk about React at a Rails conference. Yay. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So I'm very nervous, so I'm going to stutter a bit at the beginning and then get better as I go along. I know it's after lunch, it's Machi's stew, Machi's full, all that. Please bear with me, I'm going to go as quickly as I possibly can. So I'm Ben Janecke, other Ben on all the media channels, and I'm the lead software engineer for Vulkan Labs. So, a bit of motivation for this talk. Initially, what I wanted to do was like a whole history of React and where we started and what we used to do, all the way from like mix-ins and create class and then go through that. And then I realized that that was going to be 20 minutes of me telling you what's not relevant to you anymore, and then 10 minutes of me telling you what is relevant to you. So the talk changed a bit, and it became, what are my bugbears? What are the things that really annoy me? And what can we do to stop doing that? And what are the things that I like and you can do? Okay, so everyone on board with that? Good. So I think I can get away with doing a React talk in TypeScript at a Ruby conference. Yes, I do. So we're going to jump straight into it, and we're going to talk about the construction of a truly reusable component. So, prefer the use of the children prop over the use of text, label, content. This better enables composition. So a lot of this is going to be quite basic. There's also going to be more advanced stuff, something for everyone. So what's a bad example? A button that takes a text attribute is a bad example. What is a good example is a button that takes the children prop, and we can see immediately here how that enables composition. I can suddenly pass in an icon to compose that together with the component, right? Very simple. Next, unless you are explicitly trying to encapsulate, you need to expose the API of the component you are decorating. So what does that look like? So this is TypeScript. We're going to start at the very top. What I'm doing is I'm declaring the props for my button component, and I'm saying, hey, I want all the default props for the button HTML element as well. And then I'm passing that through as the props to this component. Next up, I'm taking children for composability. Then I'm taking class name. And this is so important. So many developers forget to pass class name down to their components. And what that does is it breaks 90% of the really useful libraries you want to use. Things like styled components, React transition group, any of the animation libraries, they need class names there to pass it down. All the JSS libraries break as well. So please pass down class name. And then I'm taking the remainder of the props here, and I'm passing it into the button component. Let me just get a pointer instead of a cursor. That's cool, isn't it? So I'm passing all of the remainder of the props. I'm passing down my class name. I'm composing with children. So what does this give me? It gives me the ability to set that button's type to submit, for example. If I didn't spread the props here, I wouldn't be able to do that, and I would have a not properly reusable component. Also, the style attribute needs to be there, and like 40% of the component libraries out there don't have this. You can't pass the style attribute down or class names, and that makes them almost useless. So remember to decorate properly like this. Expose the API. Next, use the proxy component pattern where you think it will be useful. So what is the proxy component pattern? If you've ever used something like Material UI or Semantic UI or Antdesign, you've seen the as prop. So this is the proxy component pattern. It's when you want to use a component, but you want it to act as something different. So a button acting as a div isn't a useful example, but a button acting as a React router link is really useful. If you've ever had like tabs or stuff that you want to tie up to your navigation, you aren't able to do this if you don't have the proxy component pattern. So let's see how we implement that. So this type definition looks really scary. It's really not. It's just two intersects in a union. So we're taking the default button attributes as we said we should. Then we're taking the as prop as anything, and then we're also telling it, hey, you might be receiving props that you don't know, and that's okay in this case because you have an as prop. Then another little thing to remember is that you generally want to forward your refs to components so people can get access to the DOM API of your components. Anyway, what we're busy with is the proxy component pattern. So we take as any, we pull as out of props, and then we go as or a default implementation, in this case button, and then we render that component. That's all there is to the proxy component pattern. It's very simple. Cool. Lastly, please expose the CSS API of nested children. So let's say I have a profile component that has like a whole bunch of things inside of it, an avatar and a detail section. Just like I want to pass class name down to your component, I want to pass it down to your children. So expose a classes attribute that has the different sections so you can pass class name down. If you want to take it to the next level, you can expose the entire API of that component in the same way you would the base decorated component. Boolean props are generally a bad idea. Consider variant props. So what does that mean? Look at this button. How do you think that's going to render? Is it going to be big? Is it going to be small? Is it going to be inverted, outline, primary? You don't know because order in JSX doesn't matter. So prefer variant props like size and variant. That makes your life a lot easier and more predictable. Deep breath. A brief aside. So a few big bugbears. There are 3 loading states. 3. Loading, loaded, and error. Okay? Let's look at how we do that. Look, so an example here is a people list. I'm rendering a table of people. Loaded is, have I ever had data for this thing? Have I done a fetch? Right? So in that case, you want to like display a full page or full area, blah, loading indicator. Loading is, am I busy fetching something new? Where you can do like an overlay over the existing data instead. Error is, did something blow up? Because you don't want to provide your user with a white screen of death, you want to provide them with something that gives them the option to try again, or just a graceful message at least. So loading, loaded, and error, not just loading, please. Next up, actions on your context can and probably should return promises, because again, this encourages composition. A very simple example of this is I have some form, and from my context, I get create and hydrate. Hydrate is a convention I use for make this context have data. And when I'm done creating, I want to reload my context. So I can just wait for it to be done creating and then reload my context. This belongs in like a service object or a service component. This is just an example to show you how you can compose promises together if you return them from your context. Next up, service components are components that return null and are a good place to like do your side effects. So this is a service component for hydrating my person page, or hydrating a person would be better. So at any point where you need a person, you can jot this down, give it the ID, and it's going to hydrate the context it needs. You'll see there's actually 3 contexts here, 2 lookup tables, and the actual person I'm using. So if my ID is different than my previous ID, I reload person, and I only once reload locations and positions. And this component returns null, and that's okay. Components that return null are called service components. Use them. Next up, my favorite part of the talk. Learn to use roots. So, in the beginning, before React, Angular, Ember, Vue, even before Backbone, there was the mighty URL. The URL was your best friend, because there were only 3 places to carry state in web applications. Query parameters, form data, and the application session. And the only way the user could get to a stateful page was by passing one of those 3 things to you. So you had to issue a GET request with some query parameters, or heck forbid a form post. And this was really, really bad because you couldn't bookmark those pages, you couldn't share those pages with anyone. That data was essentially ephemeral and for single-use state. SBAs have completely forgotten their roots, and I think that's a total tragedy. Because the mighty URL is still there, it's still as powerful as it ever was, and it's woefully underused. So let's consider a simple CRUD screen, right? So this is something you might see out in the wild built as a React app. I've got a list of people with a loading indicator and a search and some pagination and a form. And you would be able to interact with, let's go back. You would be able to interact with this thing, search, type in, create items, and the URL would stay exactly the same. And you see this a lot. I think that really sucks, and that's a crappy UX. So let's figure out what our page state is. So the most simple page state is that we have to edit or create something. So let's look at that. I have my edit form on the left here. I can go say URL is /edit/ID. Pass that down to the form. The form can have a service component that knows how to load from that ID. And with the React router route, I can render that component. Right? So this is the most basic stuff. A lot of apps do this, and I think that's great. But before we continue, we need to talk about the parts of speech of the URL. So parameters are simple. Everyone knows these. Key value, other value. A JSON representation of that looks like this. Object parameters look like this, and not a lot of people know what object parameters are. This definition is supported by Rails and by Express. So you can go page attribute equals 1, page attribute equals 2. Any object name attribute equals value. And this is a JSON representation of what this query parameter would look like. Next are array parameters. So there's two variations of array parameter. The one where you explicitly say braces, this is a list, this is a list, this is a list. Some frameworks support not having this, and just if you have multiple attributes, query parameters with the same name, they turn it into lists. I prefer being explicit and declarative with the braces. Okay, and that's a JSON representation of that again. So let's jump back to our CRUD screen and look at what our other state is, right? So we've got a search, we've got a status, we've got some pagination controls here. So I can pass my search as a query parameter. I can pass my page as a query parameter. I can pass my statuses as a query parameter. And what this means is when I refresh this page, I'm still on the page where I was. I'm still editing the record I was. I still have the search I had. And that's really powerful because now I can bookmark these things. I can share it with my colleagues and go, hey, look at this view into our data. Instead of telling them, oh, you're going to have to set up these filters to get to that page. Right. Demo time. So let's look at actual examples of some of the things I did. Wow, I have talked very quickly. Luckily, I have some backup slides. Okay. So this is an example of an app that we built recently. It's an invoicing app. And we've got here a list of records. Now, I want you to watch what happens when I update one of these filters. Boom, the URL gets updated. And I can refresh the page and be back at the same view. And it's not just one parameter that gets updated. If I select a customer here and I type live updates my URL. And that's like, okay, cool, fine, that's useful. You can refresh your page. What does that mean to me? It means a lot because now you get composability with links. So if I go through to my list of customers and I have a list of invoices here and I click on that, that doesn't have to do some fancy magic to go call a context and pass some stuff and ensure that this list is that. It just appends the query parameter, and now my list loads for that customer. And that's really nifty. So what does the code look like for this? I wish it was like really complicated and I could talk for the next 10 minutes about it, but it really, really isn't. You just use a package called useQueryParams, and this functions in exactly the same way that useState does. You get a setter and a getter, and as you update that, it updates the URL, and bing bang, you're good to go. This is, by the way, my beautiful, no problems with awesome code that no one's going to criticize me on later, hopefully. So we use query params, and then what I've got here is a use effect that actually looks at that filter that's debounced because we don't want to on every single key press go and fetch data. Looks at that filter that's debounced and then rehydrates my list with those query params just turned into a bit more of a usable object. Okay, cool. Everyone following? Since I have time, I can take questions now while the code is open. Yes?
How long do these things get?
It depends. So use your discretion, right? So I'm not saying put everything in the URL, but things that kind of make sense that you want to reuse across transitions, that you want to be bookmarkable, that you want to be shareable, go into the URL. Not everything has to be, as you can see, I do have, okay, in this case I don't have use states, but I sometimes have use states as well for things like confirmations or that school of thing. Cool. Any other questions so long before I go to my backup slides? Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Okay. Backup slide time. Flux is dead. Long live context providers. So what's a context provider? And this is super scary because I haven't live coded in a very, very long time. Let's put language to TypeScript and then use the snippet I prepared. Okay, so this is the context provider pattern. You go ahead and create a context. This is all just TypeScript boilerplate. You go ahead and you create a context, and like I said, there's 3 loading states. Let's actually go look at the app quickly to see that in action. So when you load this list, you'll see, okay, there's a full page blocking thing. That's loaded. And whenever I change a filter, you'll see here next to the title, and in the table itself, I just have quick little overlays of loading spinners. So that's loading. And if I break this, let me quickly break this. Endpoints, invoices, voices. No, that's the admin endpoint. I want this endpoint, and I want invoices. Just give me a second. Get. There we go. I'm just going to go response.send 500. Okay, we see the list breaks and I have the option to try again. So if I jump back here and I take my 500 out, save the page, save the code, jump back here and click try again, I get my list of invoices back. Okay, so loading, loaded, error. If I can get one thing into your heads in this talk, it's loading, loaded, error. Let's go back to context provider pattern. So context provider pattern, I create a context, I expose that context as a module, and then I expose a component that returns the provider for that context. Always memoizing the value that goes into the context. That is imperative, otherwise you're going to render thrash. And then managing the state for the component with hooks inside of the provider. So what you can do with the context provider pattern is actually replace a lot of your traditional container components with this pattern instead. And it gives you a little bit more flexibility around where to move things and what to do with certain things. And if you follow my rule about using or returning promises from your actions on your context providers, then you're going to have really nice composability, especially in your service objects. You're going to be able to use that. And let's jump back here. Normalizing your state isn't the same as it used to be. Use reducer isn't the be-all and end-all, and I know I'm personally responsible for this. For like the first 3-4 years of React, we all shouted, use Redux, it's the best. You need to manage your state with Redux. And use reducer was born from that. but I see a lot of overuse of useReducer. So if I jump into my real world perfect code app that no one can criticize, and I go look at my invoice context, which is the most complicated context in this application, there is no useReducer. It's all just usestate. It's all just flat state, because I can decompose my state into smaller bits. I don't need useReducer, and this is not rocket science stuff. If you've got really complicated state where you need to manage a big object and have deeply nested keys where you update, that's where reducers belong, not for managing simple state in your applications. Please. Okay. Let's jump back to, yes, Stu.
Is Redux, like in every example you use, is Redux not a part of any of those solutions?
No Redux implemented any. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'll say you use Redux when you have a really big object graph where you want to update deeply nested keys in a predictable way. At least that's my opinion. It might be wrong, but that's what I believe. Don't forget to use callback and use memo. I know it's crufty and it's like adding a few extra lines every time, and it's not completely apparent what they do. What they do is they make your app not render thrash. We don't want to render thrash our apps. And finally, this is a criticism aimed towards myself. Don't overuse context. Okay. So I finished a bit early, and that's okay because everyone wants to go take a nice long smoke break. If I can find my goodbye slide. There we go. I'm Other Ben on ZA Tech and most of the social media stuff. You can email me at benjanecke@gmail.com. Please seriously get in touch with me. If you've got even the most basic React stuff you need help with, ping me on ZA Tech and I will help you. I promise that. Or you can contract me at Vulcan Labs. I have availability in the next month or two. Cool. I have availability in the next 2 months. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. Any last questions before I go? No? Okay. Thank you, Rubyfuza.